Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Vandebout, and I'm Dean of the College of Natural Sciences here till Friday at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm very happy to welcome you all today for our conversation with award-winning author, Vauhini Vara. So this is a part of two different projects that we have in the College of Natural Sciences. First, it's a featured event within our 2-week Texas Science Festival. So the festival kicked off on Friday, and it has events happening daily that are open to the public between now and March 6th. And if you want more information, sciencefest.utexas.edu. sciencefest.utexas.edu. Lots of fun stuff that's happening. So it's also part of our college's New Equations series. So these talks happen every semester and focus especially on providing opportunities for our on-campus community of faculty and staff and students to hear from leading authors. We've covered a lot of topics over the years, but each event features an in-depth discussion relevant to our disciplines and reflective of the wide variety of varying experiences people have interacting with the technologies and methods and cultures of our disciplines. So many people in the sciences and STEM have a bit of a reputation for being a bit more comfortable with engaging with, say, data or machines than engaging with people's personal stories and experiences in the world. And today's event provides us all of this. So scientists and STEM majors, everyone else who is here, a chance to step back and reflect together. It's an opportunity to be reminded that every scientific advancement, every step forward for technology has involved people and their experiences. For centuries, this has been core, and even as AI opens up new possibilities, it is always necessary to focus on the impact of science and technology on people. And while things like science and mathematics and computing can feel very removed from people and all of our messiness, they might feel highly standardized or even neutral. In reality, the experiences that people have with technology like AI and with our scientific disciplines can vary a lot. Our college wants to make more room for important, challenging conversations like the relationships between lives in science and our lives in society and with one another. And that's why today's event, that's what today's event is in part about. So this afternoon, people are joining us both here and in person and online. So we will have a microphone available during the question and answer to just ensure that everybody can hear what is shared in the room. And it is now my pleasure to get to introduce our speakers for today. Our featured speaker is Vauhini Vara, a journalist, editor, fiction writer, essayist, and playwright. A former technology and business reporter for outlets like the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker, Vara is the author of the novel The Immortal King Rao, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, and she is the recipient of many journalism and writing awards. Her latest book is a work of nonfiction called Searches that comes out later this year. It examines how technology companies are both serving and exploiting the human desire for connection and understanding, most recently with artificial intelligence. And guiding our discussion today is our moderator, S. Craig Watkins, who is the executive director of UT's IC² Institute. Craig is the Ernst A. Sharp Centennial Professor in Communications in UT's Moody College of Communications. His research focuses on the technical, social, and ethical implications of artificial intelligence, exploring the challenges and opportunities that we face in deploying AI in high-stakes contexts like healthcare. And so thank you both, and thank you all for being here with us and committing to this hour of discovery. So Vauhini and Craig, I turn things over to you.
Where should I sit here?
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear us okay? All right, awesome, great. Well, thank you all for being here. David, Melissa, Heather, thank you so much for this opportunity. And Vauhini, thank you for being here and looking forward to the conversation today.
Me too.
So we've kind of gone back and forth on how this conversation might proceed, and so we'll see what happens. So obviously, I think at the center of this conversation today will be the sort of ever-evolving, sort of rapidly evolving technology, artificial intelligence. And so we've got a number of things to sort of address there. Maybe we could start just by you telling us a bit about how you became interested in AI, kind of what was the motivation that kind of compelled you to begin to start probing and exploring these issues that are increasingly sort of front and center of a lot of public discourse today.
Yeah. I think the first time I read in detail about large language models, so the subset of AI technologies that deal with language, was around 2015, 2016, when Google announced that it had totally revamped Google Translate. So there had been the previous version of Google Translate, and Google had been engaging in this sort of like secretive mission to figure out if they could make Google Translate way better using artificial intelligence. So using this technology that found patterns in data such as language, such that you could take an English text and convert it into a French text by being aware of these patterns, essentially. So I found that really fascinating, I think, as a journalist who for years had been covering technology, and also as a writer myself, right? And so a couple of years later, in 2017, I got an opportunity to profile Sam Altman, who's now the CEO of OpenAI. At that time was one of the founders of OpenAI. I was actually writing about his relationship with politics at the time. And, but as part of that, I got to like sit in on some AI related meetings with him. And he was sort of talking about all the ways in which this technology, in his view, was going to profoundly change society and the way we interacted with one another. So I became interested in that. A couple of years later, fast forward to, I guess, 2020, OpenAI started talking about these models, these large language models called with names like GPT-2 and then GPT-3, which were the predecessors to the models that underlie ChatGPT, which we're all familiar with. And because I had profiled Sam Altman, I was able to get like get access to that technology. In 2020 and test it out. And I was sort of like coming at it from two directions. One, with curiosity as a reporter. Two, with a sense of like both skepticism and a feeling of being threatened as a writer, right? Like, is this technology really gonna be able to like do the thing that I do? Because I should have said these models were like the first models that could generate language, right, using AI. And then thirdly, though, I had been working on the novel, that was my first book, since 2008. And so it had been like a decade that I'd been working on this novel and like banging my head against the wall and struggling to write it. And so the third component for me was like an actual interest in whether this technology could do the thing that was so hard for me to do, even though it's my day job, right? So that's sort of how my journey with AI and large language models started.
Yeah, no, there's, I know in some reporting that you've done, and I've had a chance to read an early version of your forthcoming book. Congratulations, by the way. It's coming out in next month, or April? April, yeah. Okay, we're looking forward to that. Searches. There's a part where you talk about where you're sitting in one of those meetings with Sam Altman and some of his colleagues, and he pulls out a Rubik's Cube.
Yeah.
And I think there's like a one-armed sort of robot, right, that essentially solves the Rubik's Cube puzzle.
It's like a video that he shows them of a robot. Yeah, exactly.
And then what was that? What was the sort of ensuing conversation?
Okay.
And what did this suggest to you about the potential, quote-unquote, threat of this technology to society as we know it?
Yeah, so he's talking to these entrepreneurs from Y Combinator, which is like the investment organization he was running at the time. And these entrepreneurs were, I don't remember even what the company was, but he just sort of randomly pulled out his phone and was like, hey, want to see something cool? And he showed them this video of a robot solving a Rubik's Cube in like 30 seconds or whatever with one hand. That was key, a one-handed Rubik's Cube solve. And the entrepreneurs were really taken aback and were like, wow, this is incredible. When do you think artificial intelligence or robots are going to start replacing humans in our jobs? And he kind of paused for a second, and then he was like, you know, when cars appeared, for a while, there were still jobs for horses. And now there are no more jobs for horses. and it was striking to me on a bunch of different levels. One of which is that it seemed that he was like making a comparison between what happened to horses and what could happen to humans. But the thing about being human is like we are human, and so we have a vested interest in whether there are jobs for us or not. And so that was like startling to me. I also didn't know if I bought it at the time. I'm still not sure that I buy it, right? Which I'm sure we'll talk about. But certainly I was aware from that moment, like, okay, there's some real potential threat to think about.
And we know that that's certainly one of the sort of more prominent discourses, right? It's this idea of AI as it continues to advance, leading to what is in fact like a jobless future. Yeah. And then there's some on the other end of the spectrum who say, well, no, this technology may actually lead to a sort of a creative future, right? Where it opens up whole new frontiers and possibilities of things for humans to do, work, jobs, et cetera. And so the story literally is unfolding, right? As we sit here today. So kind of thinking about, sort of taking a step back and thinking about your sort of professional trajectory, covering the tech industry, having access to some of the people who've been some of the forces behind some of the biggest platforms that the world has seen and experienced, and thinking about where you landed with searches. Could you talk a bit about what inspired you to write this book and what you're trying to achieve, what contributions you're trying to make to the broader public discourse about our humans' relationship to the machines that are in our lives today?
Yes. Yeah, I was actually at my friend Ami's house last night, and we got into a conversation with this about this. And I said, you know, this is actually what my book is about. So the subject of the book is the first thing that I wrote, that when I didn't know that it was going to end up being the germ of a book, was this essay made up of a decade's worth of my own Google searches. So what happened was in like 2019, I was reading an article about, you know, all the functionality Google uses to like offer us insight into our own use of Google, but then also to gain insights for itself, right, as a company. And one of those things was data on all of our searches on Google. And I realized that actually I had never opted out of Google's collection of all that data about me. And so when I went back and looked in my account, Google had been tracking since 2005 every single Google search that I had conducted. And this may be true for many people in the audience too, whether you're aware of it or not. And it was like alarming to realize that, but also fascinating. Like I went in and looked at my very first Google search that Google had tracked, and it was an image search for world's ugliest dog.
And remember the day you made that search?
What's that?
Do you remember the day?
I do not. No, I was like, what kind of idiot searches for this on Google? I wouldn't have believed that I searched for world's ugliest dog on Google if you told me. But there is evidence of it. And so what that got me thinking about, so I ended up writing this essay sort of made up of my own Google searches. But what that got me thinking about was about the way in which like sometimes in our discourse, we either, like you come across people who are either like, these big technology companies are taking advantage of us and exploiting us and amassing great power and wealth in the process. And then often on the part of the companies themselves and some employees of these companies, the argument is, many of our products are free, you're using, and some of them are paid, you're using these products, in some cases, you know, choosing to pay for them, in other cases, choosing to allow us to collect your data in return for using them, because clearly you get some benefit out of it. And so it felt like in my Google searches themselves and in the fact that I had allowed Google to collect this, when I discovered it was collecting it, I actually I proactively decided not to turn off the feature. I was like, here is a kind of artifact of how both of those things are true at once. And to me, it feels like the book is about that. It sort of is like swimming in that murkier the waters having to do with like our own complicity in the rise in power and wealth of these companies.
Yeah, no, there's this whole paradigm around surveillance capitalism and the degree to which these technologies are manipulating or exploiting us, and there's certainly some elements of that, right, but also the degree to which we get a chance to express and do things that otherwise might be, you know, virtually impossible. So, so the trade-offs are really quite striking and interesting.
Yeah.
So in your book, Searches, there's a chapter on what I think has become probably one of your better known pieces, certainly one of your more viral pieces, is an essay that you wrote back in 2021, Ghost.
Yeah.
And anyone familiar with Ghost? Anyone read Ghost? A few people have. No worries, you'll know all about Ghost by the time you leave here today. In my opinion, your experience writing Ghost, and even more importantly, sort of your assessment of that experience, has significant implications for how we think about the relationship between human intelligence and machine intelligence. And so for the people who aren't familiar with Ghost, maybe we could do a little kind of demo for them.
Sure.
Perhaps you could sort of first describe to them
Explain
what you
it
did,
is, yeah.
and then we'll share a couple of passages to give some perspective in terms of what we'll talk about.
Okay, cool. So when I wrote to Sam Altman and said, can I use this GPT-3 that I'm hearing about? And he and his people said yes. I got access to this like web app called, it was labeled like the Playground, where you could type some text and then hit a button and GPT-3 would basically continue the text for you. And so I started just playing around with all kinds of different things, and it got me thinking about like, I was sort of like, why would someone want to use a technology like this? And it got me thinking about the things for me that I struggled to write about. And for me, the sort of thing on the top of that list, the personal experience on the top of that list, was that my sister died of cancer when we were both in college. And it was something that like, I still struggle to like find words for, both verbal or written. And so I wondered what would happen if I tried to get this technology to like help me tell that story. So is that a good setup? And do you want me to?
Maybe the very first thing you entered, and
Okay.
then we can talk a bit about kind of what ensued after that.
Okay, cool. So here it is. Okay, so I'm gonna read you, this first sentence is what I wrote. My sister, that's my cousin. Everyone say, hi, Maggie.
Hi, Maggie.
Okay. My sister was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma when I was in my freshman year of high school, and she was in her junior year. So I press the button, and here's how GPT-3 continues. I had just started playing lacrosse, and she was really excited for that. I don't think I understood what Ewing sarcoma was. I just knew it was a type of cancer. When I went to visit her in the hospital, it was really the first time I was able to see what this disease was and how it affects the body. She went through a lot of different treatments and was in and out of the hospital for a long time. It was hard to see my sister go through that. I wasn't able to see much of her during her treatment, and I wanted to be there for her. I was able to visit her a lot, but there were times where I couldn't because we were on the road playing lacrosse. Eventually, she went into remission and got the all clear and was able to play lacrosse with me for a season. I was a freshman and she was a senior, so that was really cool when she got to play again. She had a lot of friends at school and people who supported her. I think that was really special for her because she had a lot of support from people she didn't even know. She's doing great now. So that's the end of that first bit.
And when you saw that, you obviously had a very powerful or initial response.
Yeah.
And so what was the response, and then what was your engagement with GPT after that?
So I had a very like visceral negative response to, especially the end of it, right? Like what more upsetting thing could this machine tell me than like the thing that I wish were true, but is the opposite of what is true, right? That my sister is doing great now.
All that's completely made up.
Totally, yeah, and I don't play, to be clear, like I never played lacrosse, my sister never played lacrosse, right? Yeah, so I was sort of like, oof, it was like a punch in the gut or something. And what that compelled me to do was to think, okay, I need to try again. And so then what I did was I went in, I kept that first sentence, but then I wrote more of my own text and then tried hitting the button again. And that basically kind of happened over and over. I sort of did that 9 times, each time writing more of my text and having less of the AI model's text.
And so this is where I think this story gets incredibly fascinating, and why I think in many ways it's illustrative of the broader issue that I think is one of the issues that's at stake in terms of humans and our intelligence and our relationship to human intelligence. Machine intelligence. How do we navigate this technology? And you make some really interesting observations about your own experience, because as I understand it, what's happening is, at least for you, as you're going back and forth with ChatGPT, you're beginning to find the words that you think best describe emotions, experiences, concerns that you've never really been able to articulate and certainly write about.
Yep.
And so in that sense, right, you were able to use the machine as a catalyst for really sort of identifying and articulating your own voice, your own agency in this experience, which I think is a really sort of fascinating kind of process. Maybe you could talk a bit about how you think ChatGPT in that regard helped you to find your voice as a person, as a writer?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was essentially, each time GPT-3, this ChatGPT predecessor, produced some text, it kind of in each iteration, it got closer to articulating something. I'm using these words with air quotes because like it's not sentient, right? It's not conscious, but it's not articulating, it's producing text, but it got closer to producing text that felt closer to something describing what it actually feels like to be human in grief. However, it was never my experience the way I would describe it, right? Because it's not human, and more importantly, I think it's not me, right? It doesn't have a consciousness, and it doesn't have my consciousness. And so I kept like that tension, the fact that it wasn't producing like what I actually needed to express is kind of what propelled me then to use my own words, almost sort of like writing against the falsehoods that it was creating.
There's a part where you write about where one of the pieces of generative text that GPT created was describing you and your sister in a very intimate moment, holding hands. And you talk about how that struck you. It was compelling. It brought out, I think, emotions or feelings that you maybe didn't even necessarily know that you had or hadn't tapped into. But then it also provoked you to ask some really challenging questions about this technology and what it means for humans to interact with it.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about kind of that particular passage and your response.
And maybe
to it.
I won't read the whole thing, but maybe I'll just read the line so people know what that is. So basically, there's a part of the essay eventually where I talk about going to Clark Beach, this beach in my hometown with my sister. So we walk down to the beach, and then we're walking back up. And so I've written that part. I guess I'll just read the one line I wrote. I wrote, we'd go down to Clark, she began moving slowly and carefully. We'd go down to Clark Beach that spring that she was dying. She wanted to show us where to spread her ashes. And when we walked back up, I'd have to put a hand on the small of her back and push her. So that's the line I wrote about about Clark Beach. And so later on, GPT-3 produces this sentence that goes, this is the end of part 7. So it goes, we were driving home from Clark Beach and we were stopped at a red light and she took my hand and held it. This is the hand she held, the hand I write with, the hand I am writing this with. She held it for a long time. I looked at our hands, hers so much paler than mine. She was still holding my hand when the light turned green. I didn't want her to let go. I wanted her to hold my hand for the rest of my life. And I sometimes say that like those lines about like the hand I write with, the hand I'm writing this with, in my view, are the best lines of the essay, which is really complicated to say because it's my essay. I want it to be mine, but it was written by this model. And part of why I say it's the best, they're some of the best lines from like a literary perspective is that as a reader, it feels like it's sort of like integrating kind of what the essay is about at its core, right? Like the difficulty of reconciling myself now with the self that coexisted with my sister, right? The difficulty of reconciling that, but then also the fact that those are the same person and the beauty in that fact, right? So it was sort of like, with this language was getting at that, I thought, in like a way that struck me as original. There's this debate, as many of you know, I'm sure, in in philosophy circles, in political circles, having to do with like this question about whether AI can be thought of as having consciousness, right? And a lot of times that, or whether AI can even write persuasively, which I think is part of this conversation. And one thing that comes up is like, well, AI language models aren't embodied. And so, of course, they're not capable of like writing the way an embodied person would. And yet here, it's actually writing about embodiment in a very, what to me as a reader struck me as very sophisticated. And so I had to contend with that. Like, does that then mean, okay, so apparently AI can produce language that is sophisticated in the way that like I'm seeking sophistication as a reader. Does that mean like there's no job for me anymore? Or does it not mean that?
No, really interesting. I think as you have continued to kind of assess your own experience here, you importantly, I think, try to make some distinctions between what AI is capable of, but also its limits, compared to the superpowers that humans have, right? That machines don't have. And so as we think about like, the title of this event, if I can write, if AI can write, why should we? How are you sort of grappling with that? How are you reconciling that? As a writer, as a journalist, what kinds of skills do you think you develop, for example, that would be difficult to automate?
Yeah, I mean, where I have eventually landed is in thinking about what the origins of communication were in the first place, and like what we use it for when we as humans are communicating with one another. I think we often don't think about this, but when we communicate as humans, whether we're speaking or writing, there are these sort of two complementary parts, right? There's the perspective of, so when I'm speaking, there's my perspective as the speaker or as the writer, but there's also an awareness on my part of who I'm speaking to. So right now, like for example, just to think out loud, part of my brain is thinking of myself just in conversation with you, Craig, right? And so I'm like, there's certain shared language that I know we can use because I know you are an expert in AI and you think about AI in society. And then at the same time, I have in another part of my brain an understanding of the people in this room, the people who are on Zoom, right? And so I have this like, as a human, we all have this pretty sophisticated understanding of like this, we have this kind of sophisticated model of communication that we build anytime we communicate without necessarily thinking about it much. The thing about AI large language models is that they produce text, but that text by design does not reflect any individual perspective, literally because of the ways these models are built, right? They're like sucking in, they're being given billions and billions of words from across the internet, other sources of text, and then making predictive assessments about which words are most likely to appear in which order, right? And so it has nothing to do with like having a perspective. And the other interesting thing is that it has no way of building a model for like the listener, right? The reader or the listener. Some might argue, yes, but in a chat bot, like the promise of that OpenAI is making is that if I keep using ChatGPT, it's going to learn about me and it's going to be able to communicate with me on my terms. I think the argument that I would make is that that's not communication in the way, it's like something that looks like communication. It's this kind of representation of the language of communication without actually being communication. And so there's this like fundamental difference between the language I produce as a writer and the language a model produces. The question then becomes like, does that matter? And I can say that for me as a writer, it matters because when I communicate, what I'm trying to do is form, establish, and continue actual relationships with actual human beings, whether they're people I know or kind of like other human beings on a more abstract level. Whereas that's not what this text produced by AI models is trying to do. Another interesting question though is like, does it matter to a reader? Does it matter to a listener? And I think because my job is to publish books and publish journalism, that is a job that is dependent on an industry where the revenue for that industry actually comes from readers deciding whether it matters to them, right? So I think that's like another interesting question. Like regardless of whether it matters to me, does it ultimately matter to a reader to know? Ultimately, I think I wouldn't be surprised if AI models can produce like something that looks like literature, and not the kind of wooden, stiff, chat GPT kind of language, but actual literature. So like if and when that's possible, will it matter to readers, like whether that was produced by a computer, by an AI model or not?
No, as I was thinking about some of your work and your ideas and just your kind of analyses of this environment that we're in, this idea about AI not having consciousness, for example, and not having context awareness, and some of the things that you just alluded to. I wonder, do you think we are moving in a direction where that may not be true in the not too distant future? In other words, where we could begin to, with some degree of precision, train a model to have a perspective, train a model to speak from a particular voice or experience. And so in that sense, right, beginning to, I think, as you might suggest, to sort of replicate or perform, right, that awareness or consciousness, but still, because it's a machine, could never really know or never really care or never have expertise just because of the manner in which this technology functions and operates. But is that possible, you think, to be able?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thought experiment. Okay, so on the one hand, large language models now rely on huge amounts of text from all these different sources, right? But as you know, as I'm sure many people in the audience know, increasingly smaller models are being built that rely on smaller amounts of text. It's certainly not yet technically possible to use, for example, text only from myself, right, to train a model that represents only my perspective. But maybe there's some future in which it could be. And then, I think that my argument shifts a little, because one could ask, well, then couldn't there theoretically be a model that represents your perspective? What I would argue in response to that, and maybe these are all self-serving arguments, obviously, right? What I would like to argue in response to that is that another thing that makes not just humans, but sentient animals who we are is, and maybe especially humans in one particular way, in that we have a very sophisticated language, is that we change. Like, I'm a different person now from the person I was 10 years ago, or even, I would argue, 5 seconds ago, right? And so if that's the case, then an AI model trained on everything I've written up until 10 minutes ago is still not going to represent my perspective, right? Because it doesn't know which direction, which of the infinite vectors that I could then move along to get to become the next version of the person I'm going to end up on.
You said something really interesting a moment ago about how readers will respond to generative AI-generated content. And I think it's a really fascinating question. If we think about a lot of the projections about, the fact that, the majority of content that we consume on the internet in the not too distant future will likely all be AI-generated content.
Yeah.
So what does that mean for our information environment? What does that mean for the media sort of, content that we consume if it's increasingly sort of machine-generated as opposed to human-generated? But something that you asked earlier or raised earlier is, will readers care, right?
Yeah.
Will they care if this was machine-generated or if this was human-generated? And what will be that line of distinction in terms that might determine whether or not they care?
Right.
Will they expect certain forms of content or certain kinds of content, they're okay with that being AI-generated? But if there are other kinds of things, a novel or some other experience, would prefer that be sort of influenced or created by a human? How are you thinking about sort of future kind of consumption, future environment in terms of where this content will be increasingly ever present, and how we as humans begin to make a distinction between AI and human-generated content?
Yeah, I don't know, because on the one hand, my instinct is to say that when written text has mostly a kind of informational value, it doesn't matter to us who produced that text, right? As long as we can verify its accuracy. And then where there's some other value in addition to information or other than information, right? It may matter more to know that an individual human produced it. So for example, if I want to know, if I've got, garlic and tomatoes in my home and I want to make a pasta sauce and like Google can generate like a quick recipe for me, I could maybe argue that like to me it doesn't matter. Like if it can produce that recipe and I can use it and it's fine, it doesn't matter what created it. But the underlying, that assumes that like human generated text and AI generated text are sort of like exist in separate vacuums. But in reality, we know that the reason Google knows how to create that recipe is that it has consumed all of these human written recipes, right? About how to make pasta and use that information to give me this AI generated recipe. And so I just don't know how like a ecosystem works in the future in which none of us are going to, I don't know, Epicurious or the New York Times cooking app or whatever to get our recipes because we can just produce them with ChatGPT, given that because those apps are relying on human generated content. So if like the New York Times can't make any money anymore because nobody's going there, like where does the training material come from? Do we end up in this sort of like infinite AI generated slop loop, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about something else that you have sort of thought about and sort of contemplated is how your writing has changed and is evolving as a professional journalist. One of the really interesting things, obviously, about the sort of acceleration of generative AI is the degree to which it's encroaching upon, many different forms of expertise. We know, for example, right, that it's increasingly, I won't say it's a threat to, but it's certainly greater exposure, right, to certain kinds of careers, highly educated careers, careers that require working with information, processing information, summarizing information, generating reports. I mean, just the sort of rising tide of things that AI can do, and really sort of thinking about, well, what does that mean, right, for humans, right? And back to some of the earlier things that we talked about, like the future of work, for example. Yeah. I'm wondering if you could, from your own personal experience as a journalist, talk about how you think AI is changing journalism, and what you think the stakes are for future journalists.
Yeah. I mean, my hot take on this is that I wonder, and I would actually be curious about your perspective on this as well, because I know it's something that you think about a lot. I wonder whether we're giving too much away to these big technology companies by assuming that they and like their CEOs and their investors and the consultants they hire who then write these reports about the future of work, whether we're giving too much away to them by assuming that like that discourse saying that AI is going to render certain jobs irrelevant or at least change them significantly, like to assume that that's accurate. Because I think the truth is, I'm not saying that it's wrong, but I don't know that like Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman knows any more than I do. I mean, I know he knows his technology well. I think those people are obviously intelligent people who have been successful at running companies. But I don't think any of us can predict what the future is. And I think for me, that's interesting and useful to keep in mind because it then suggests that there are all kinds of sort of like counter rhetorical positions that can be taken or counter speculations that can be offered, right? Like I could like, write some op-ed for the New York Times saying, actually, in the future, AI is going to hit a wall and not be able to do anything more sophisticated than what it's doing now. In fact, there seems to be some evidence that companies are hitting a wall. And actually, it's all going to be fine. And like, there will be technologies that change the world, just as there have been for millennia. And the thing that Sam Altman says is going to happen is not going to happen. And if I had like the power and wealth and connections of Sam Altman, like I could like get that message to Congress. I could get McKinsey to produce a report, But lacking that, something that I can do and that we all can do is like we do have collective capacity as individual human beings to like tell different stories and bring those stories into being, just like the companies do.
Yeah, I suspect, right, that the view that AI is going to lead to either a jobless future or a creative future, that I don't think it's not an either or kind of scenario or proposition. I think both will happen. And I think there's evidence that both are already happening, right? That in some cases it is leading to displacement, and in other cases it's leading to flourishment and new opportunities as well. I think the issue, right, is sort of distribution, right? Who's most likely to be impacted in terms of being jobless versus who's most likely to find creative opportunity, advancement, a trajectory upwards, right, in this environment. And we all know, right, that the stakes are very different, right, for all of us in terms of who has access to those skills, resources. You were just in school earlier today here in Austin that's doing some really interesting things in terms of integrating AI into the curriculum, into the educational experience. But we know not all young students and kids have access, right, to those kinds of learning opportunities. So really interesting. I'm also struck by, this idea that, AI. I think you're right? I mean, there's certainly, I think, the threat that if we're not careful, the ways in which the big companies are moving forward with AI, and it's really only a handful, right? Here in this country, maybe a couple in China that are really sort of driving a lot of this technology. Where is, and I think what you're getting at, right, is where is the human agency aspect, right? And how do we begin to create an environment, a space, sort of a mindset, a collective mindset and ethos as a society that we have and should have a stake, right, in whatever the future of AI is. And really trying to sort of think about and preserve our own sense of agency in terms of not necessarily what AI does to us, but what we as a society choose to do with artificial intelligence. And I think that'll be a really interesting and sort of compelling viewpoint and perspective to take moving forward. Just kind of thinking about where you are now in terms of your career and how you're thinking about AI. Is there anything in this sort of growing discussion, conversation, increasing awareness around AI and generative AI in particular, is there anything that you think is missing from the conversations that are happening today? And if so, what might that be, and what do you think the implications are for what we may be overlooking as it relates to this technology?
I don't know. I mean, there are probably so many things that I'm overlooking, right? But one thing that I just happen to have been thinking about lately, I think partly because I'm a writer, is the way in which I think when we talk about AI, a lot of large language models in particular, like the way we frame the question is this stuff any good or is it crap, right? Like, and the argument for these technologies are bad is like, they're inaccurate, they tell us to like pour glue on our pizza. I don't know if people saw that, but there was, Google's Gemini model was like telling people that to make their pizza better, they should pour glue on it. Like when they write prose, when they try to write like a story, it's full of cliches and it's really bad. So like oftentimes that's the argument against. And then the argument in favor is like, this is supercharging productivity. It actually like, you can get an email done really quickly. You can, translate from one language to another really quickly. And I think what's lost in that conception of what AI does is actually like the value of slow, hard human work. So I think about that as a writer because it took me 13 years to write my novel. It took me more than 10 years to write my short story collection. This book, I started in 2019. So, it's been 6 years since I started this book. And there has been value for me as a writer in the fact that it was really hard. I didn't know what I was doing. I had to it took a lot of effort to even understand what I was thinking and how to communicate it. And I find that there's tremendous value in that effort, but it's not a kind of value that's rewarded in the economic systems that sort of organize society and dictate like how we determine value, So that's something that I've been thinking about lately.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It makes me think about, well, I wanted to ask you this. So what we've been talking about isn't necessarily entirely unprecedented, right? I mean, there have obviously been previous generations of technology that have changed what we do and how we do it, how we create, how we communicate, how we express ourselves. Thinking about, for example, the emergence of, 100, 150 years ago, whenever cameras were invented, a lot of people were concerned, right? Because, cameras were presumably going to replace like portrait artists, right?
Yeah.
People actually took time to paint, right? People's portraits. That was a particular skill. It required years of craftsmanship to develop it. And then now you have this technology, a camera that could do it like in an instant, right? And people felt like, does that cheapen the creative process? Does it in some ways lead to the destruction of a skill set and a form of artistic expression that's really important to the human experience? And it's not so much, obviously, right, cameras didn't bring the end to portraits, it just changed how we produce portraits, right? And who produces them and the skills and training required to do that. And I wonder, right, if we're, and there's certainly other examples of that as well, and I wonder if we're entering like a similar kind of story with AI, right? And so we're talking about writing, but we could also be talking about painting, coding, right? Any number of things, right? Teaching, all of the things, right, that AI can either assist us in doing, or in some cases, you could automate it to do some of those functions, right? And so I guess partly what I'm thinking is, will the arrival and sort of expanding sort of capabilities of AI, will it bring the end to these things that we do, or will it simply enable us to do them in very different kinds of ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting example, like the advent of the advent of the camera, because on the one hand, people learned to use cameras and use those to make portraits and made a good living doing that. On the other hand, modernism was invented, right? And like Picasso and artists like him started changing the way painting looked very much in response to that technology. At the same time, it's also true that I think like painters did have less cultural influence after the advent of the camera than before it, right? And so the question is, like, I think one question is, will AI, what will AI accomplish? How good will it be in the future? And we just don't know. Like, has it hit a wall? Is it going to get better? Are the companies that create these technologies invested in like creative uses of them, which is another interesting question. But if we assume that like there will be a kind of parallel development of these technologies, then one question I have is like, what is the equivalent change that takes place? Does it mean that there are some writers who are very skilled at generating text using AI models, right? That like a sort of new generation of writers who do that, whereas writers who are very invested in human writing, and I would put myself in that category, end up reinventing what human writing does in such a way that it, like what writers produce could not be replicated, could not be done. Like the literal text output would not be possible on the part of AI models, and I don't know what exactly that looks like, you know? One very simple way of characterizing it would be to say that like it will put, I think, potentially a premium on originality, right? Because one thing that AI models are really good at is the conventional, again, because of the way they're built. And so if we can be original as humans, if we can come up with thoughts that reflect our own unique perspectives, that are conveyed with an understanding of who we're conveying them to, like that's something that we can do that's different.
I totally agree. Well, this has been great, but we wanted to make some time for you to ask questions or any thoughts or reflections that you have for Vauhini. So we'll open the floor up if there are any questions or observations, reflections.
I want to hear what this person in the front right here who kept nodding at controversial hot takes has to say. But I'm not going to put you on the spot, so if you have any. I'm interested in what your own background is, what your relationship to AI is.
I'm a mathematician.
Okay.
Background. But I'm a fan of literature. I want to read your books, and I value a lot of the things you said, premium on originality. I'm worried if the line, this is the hand that I write with, I'm worried if that's just a plagiarism of something some other author has written.
Right. How does this apply to math? I'm curious. Like, how do you think about these questions as they relate to being a mathematician?
Well, I can tell you that the GPT models have gotten better because every year I give it my exam questions and it's doing better than it did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And recently it's done very well on the International Math Olympiad, like
Right.
a worldwide problem-solving contest. So
I guess,
getting
like, as a
better.
mathematician, in a way, like, mathematicians, I imagine, have been, like, thinking about this since calculators became affordable.
Yeah, I don't know. A leading mathematician, Terry Tao, thinks it will assist human mathematicians in proofwriting. And to some extent, that's already happening.
Yeah, okay.
But I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Hi, I'm Julie. Before you started, I tried to answer the question that was up on the screen, and I wrote because it helps us understand. It helps us understand ourselves, and it helps us understand each other.
Yeah.
And I really resonated with you when you were talking about how hard it is to write something.
Yeah.
Casey and I just finished writing a paper on an AI tool that we co-developed, and when I sat down to write it, I just write the paper. And I shared this with Casey. I didn't want to use AI. I thought I just want to do this myself. I don't want to use the aid.
Yeah.
I just want to work this out on my own.
Yeah.
And so I ended up doing that. And then when I submitted the paper, the journal asked, "Did you use AI to assist you in any way when you wrote this?" And I was able to say no. But I just really, it's not a question per se, but just a comment that sometimes you really don't know what you want to say or what you want to articulate until you do that, what can be traumatic
Totally.
writing process. So I just really appreciated what you shared. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because for me as well, like, it became clear to me in writing that essay, Ghosts, that for I think all of us who communicate in whatever way, whether like you're professionally a writer or you write academic papers or you write emails to your friends, like I think that's the point of writing. It's similar to the point of speaking. Like, you figure out what it is that you're thinking through the writing itself. And so if you use a technology to bypass that, then you will not have had the insight that you were meant to have. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I've long admired that essay, and I have your book. I want to read it. I'm a fiction writer, and I was thinking about process, what the person in the front talked about, and just how even just the process of writing a book is so precarious in the sense that you don't really know if anyone will read it because of publishing, right? And so you have to just either believe in the process and engage in it because you love that, or you don't. But I was wondering about how you see the role of if you're using AI in writing fiction. How does that? Just the question of disclosure, and or anything, really anything. I think the person at the front. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but that question at the end of a paper, did you use AI to help you? And I think that's so interesting, and I wonder, is that something that you've thought about?
Yeah.
People are thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things where we probably each come up with our own ethical framework. I think partly because of my journalism background, feel very strongly about transparency and disclosure. So for example, in this book, there are various things, kind of experiments, in which I engage with AI. I actually, once I finished writing the book, I took 2 chapters at a time and fed them to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT to engage with me about them, and it said some really, I was less interested in its insights on my book than I was in what it would reveal about itself as a technology, and I found that interesting. But at the end, I have this notes on process section where I describe the use of AI technologies and other technologies in the writing of the book. For me, I mean, I think one can do, like, because writing is a form of communication, there is a contrast between, I think, a writer and a reader, or like a speaker and an audience member, where there's like what we hope for is to have a kind of shared understanding of what is happening within the communication. And so, for example, like, say, you know, Craig were to share his questions with me in advance and I were to like generate answers using AI, and say this whole conversation, you didn't know it, but it was actually like everything I've said was generated with AI, right? Yeah, we did not do that. But it would feel, I think, to many of you like a breach, right? Because the expectation, at least in 2025, in a conversation like this, is that we're like talking organically. My words are like human words that are coming from a human thought process. It would be interesting to think about what would happen if at the beginning of the conversation, if I had done that, if at the beginning I had said, listen, just so you know, everything I'm saying here has been generated by ChatGPT. I want to be upfront about it. Like, then you would know, and I could do that, and everybody here would have an understanding of it. I think my question about that is similar to the question I would have for readers, which is like, is that satisfying? You know, would that be of interest? So yeah, I think there are all kinds of interesting ways these things can be used, and disclosure for me is important.
Thank you for taking questions. What I'm wondering is, can we expect AI systems to become entities with a history? For example, I come into this room, you are all friends, co-workers, and I start meeting people. I hear about your sister, I meet another person, then you and I happen to meet again at the coffee table and start talking, continue to remember the different characters that I'm interacting with, like people, right?
Yeah.
Can we expect systems to evolve to that kind of level, to where they have to remember all these things that they have done in their life, or are they going to remain as transactional systems?
So Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, and executives and leaders of these other technology companies do describe a future in which we each have AI agents who are sort of like AI, not replicas of ourselves, obviously, but sort of like AI versions of ourselves who know everything about us, all our contacts, all our context, and, you know, like, so I can say to my AI replica, AI agent, you know, I want to order something for dinner tonight. This is a simple version, you know, and it knows exactly what I want. That is transactional, but I think they imagine a world in which it goes deeper than that. I think what is technologically possible is like whatever aspects of human existence can be datafied, you know, it can be turned into data points. And I think probably there are people who would argue like, listen, every aspect of existence can be turned into a data point, and therefore, yes, an AI agent will be capable of doing that. There are people on the other end of the spectrum who would say nothing about human experience can be turned into a data point, and so an AI agent is like functionally or definitionally incapable of it. And there are probably a lot of people who fall in the middle, and I'm laying that out just to think out loud about the spectrum of possible ways to think about it. I don't know how I would respond to that question for myself.
Hi. Really, really interesting stuff. I'm wondering, one of the things I think about with AI is that, or at least with large language models, I feel like it's a bit of a misnomer to call it artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And I think that inaccuracy leads to like misunderstandings in the way that we interact with it. Yeah. And so I was wondering about your perspective on that, if you think that, specifically with large language models, if you think that calling it something else, not trying to personify it in the way that humans tend to do, would make it safer in some way to engage with interpersonally.
Yeah. If you tell me if you don't have thoughts beyond this, but if I can put you on the spot, I am curious about one small thing, which is when you say it's a misnomer, like, can you just say something about what you mean by that, why you consider it a misnomer?
Yeah, well, when I think about intelligence, and as a scientist working with animals, as a neuroscientist, I think about intelligence a lot, and like what it means to be intelligent. There's a lot of things that animals do that we don't classify as intelligence.
Totally,
And basic mimicry would fall into that. You know, a parrot can mimic the sound of a person talking, but that's not the same as actually communicating. And so I think of AI, or I think of, you know, large language models, I think they should be called, you know, like language mimicry engines or something like that, that makes it more clear that this is not an intelligent entity. You know, I don't know.
I'm so glad I asked you that question, because it's a really fascinating point. I mean, I think when we as humans define intelligence, in fact, when artificial intelligence was coined as a term, the definition they gave it was, I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but it was like a machine that can do tasks that would be called intelligent if a human were doing them, or something like that, which is to say it was mapped specifically against like the outcomes of human behavior that we call intelligent, which is to say it was like mapped to human intelligence, right? I have a friend who's an artist who shared with me this paper, I forget what it was called, but it was about beavers and bees and like the kinds of intelligence that can be attributed to those, the way in which like beavers are very sophisticated engineers, for example. And probably humans learned some things about engineering by watching what beavers did, but we don't give the beavers the credit, right? So I think that's such a compelling point. I think a lot of times things get their names, especially products get their names, because the people who are selling us those products have an incentive to give the products those names. And so I think it's worth thinking about like why it's beneficial to companies to call their products artificial intelligence. My hunch is that one thing that's beneficial about that is that like it sounds impressive to us, right? It makes us think that we associate artificial intelligence with like the things we have been reading about in sci-fi, you know, since the turn of the last century, right? That are really cool. And so I think those companies would lose that if they called this something else. I mean, these scholars, Emily M. Bender and Alex Hanna, have this book coming out in May called The AI Con, and they argue in that book that like there's no such, they say artificial intelligence is just a marketing term. I don't know that I would go that far, but they say artificial intelligence doesn't exist, and if we got rid of that term, that would kind of make these technologies seem a lot less powerful than they currently seem. So I think there's something to that. I could go on and on about different aspects of that question, but thank you for sharing that. That's a really interesting perspective.
I'm getting the signal that we've hit time, and so thank you so much. And thank you. Yes.
Next word guesser doesn't sound very amazing. But I was also thinking about asking my digital twin what I want for dinner, and it responding, if you don't know, I don't know.
Yeah.
So if anybody out there watching or who is here hasn't read Vauhini's writing, please check her out. She is a really thoughtful and innovative writer, and I highly encourage you to go ahead and pre-order Searches. We spent a lot of time today in the realm of discussing the artificial. Conversations like today's are a great reminder about what makes us uniquely human. And I hope that you take the extra step of continuing the conversation with someone after you leave our talk. So tell somebody about something you learned, or something that made you think, or something that you reconsidered after today's exchange. And at UT and in the sciences, we believe in the importance of having experiences in community to support learning and shared growth. So again, I invite you to continue the examination of our relationships with technology that this discussion began, and carry it forward with you in your conversations and reflections with others. So I want to thank Vauhini Vara and Craig Watkins for being here and sharing so many insights with us. And then on behalf of the University of Texas at Austin, I also want to thank all of you for attending, submitting questions, asking, active participation. You can find more exciting events happening throughout the week at Texas Science Festival in the coming days. And again, our website, sciencefest.utexas.edu. And thanks again, and a wonderful evening to everyone.